Welcome to the February 2017 OEM update for Microsoft Australia. In this webinar, we'll be covering off, first of all, a quick run through of the differences between the different Windows Server editions. So this is just something that we're doing on a monthly basis to make sure that people are aware of what the differences are. And then this month's special focus is on remote desktop services, including remote desktop server enhancements, the integration of multi-point server into Windows Server 2016 as opposed to being a separate product, and also the ability and a discussion around deploying Office on remote desktop services. So this is especially important for those of you who may not have done this for a while or may have done it with older versions of Office or older versions of Windows Server and are wondering what has changed. And then we'll move on to resources. So what are some of the important things that are coming up? What are some of the important locations you need to be visiting on the web to keep up to date with what we're up to in the OEM team? So first up, let's take a look at Windows Server editions. So from the OEM side, we've still really got the three primary versions. We've got the Essentials edition, so 50 devices or less, and it must be the root of the domain. So nothing too major has really changed with Essentials. But then as we get into Standard and Data Center editions, important things to note there is that now Data Center does have additional functionality targeted at larger customers over on the Data Center side. So things like storage spaces, direct storage replica, a new networking controller, as well as shielded VMs and Host Guardian service. Now we've actually covered these topics in previous recordings, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But other things that are worth revisiting from the standard and data center columns is that, first of all, the CALs are still the same as we had with Server 2012 and 2012 R2 from a licensing perspective. So we have to license it per device or per user. We've got the same virtual machine licensing requirements. So 2 virtual machines with standard and unlimited virtual machines with data center. And now we've also got the concept of containers. So we've got unlimited Windows Server containers across both versions, but with Standard Edition we've got 2 Hyper-V containers, or with Data Center Edition we've got unlimited Hyper-V containers. So if we take a look here at some of the differences again between the different versions, we'll just really focus on the top versions here, which is the Data Center Edition and Standard. So both of those are core-based licensing, so this is something that we have been covering in a lot of detail over the last few months, and it's something that we will keep revisiting, including a series of live webinars that we'll do. But also along with the core-based licensing, you do have the Windows Server CAL requirements. So if we keep going through now and start jumping in and taking a look at the remote desktop services enhancements. So if we take a look at all the different types of scenarios or situations where people might be looking at remote desktop, we've got things like VDI, desktop as a service, good old remote desktop services, a lot of different terms that people might be using around what it is they're actually offering. So in some cases it could be offering a standalone Windows desktop VM that only that user has got access to, or it could be a shared environment like we've had traditionally with remote desktop services. So as we take a look, what are the reasons that somebody might want to deploy remote desktop services? So first up, it gives us the ability to run our traditional Windows apps on desktops anywhere. So not necessarily desktops, it could be different types of mobile devices as well. Now for deployment flexibility, some of you may host and manage the remote desktop service environments for your customers. Some of your customers may run remote desktop services natively in-house. Now, for some organizations, one of the focuses for going through and looking at remote desktop services is around cost reduction. So how do they go through and just have one centralized environment where they can go through and manage and control, so from a patching perspective, from a deployment perspective, from an ongoing maintenance perspective, rather than having to do all of that across a large variety of devices. And then finally, it's an extensible platform, so you can go through and leverage additional security technologies over and above what Microsoft does provide. So for the solutions to meet your requirements, if we take a look here, we've got session-based desktops. So these are our traditional remote desktop server type approaches, where we've got a server or a VM that we've got remote desktop services running on, and users connect in and get their own session on that same Windows Server instance. Now this is something that we can do via a full desktop experience. We can also publish it via a remote app. Now this is cost effective and it's very easy to manage. Now as we take a look at the virtual desktop infrastructure side, what we can start doing here is provide access to personal virtual desktops or pooled virtual desktops which are running Windows client operating systems. And we'll talk about what the supported versions of Windows are for this. Now, because it falls outside of the scope of OEM licensing, we'll talk about the scenarios, but if you need to know more about the licensing, especially around the VDI scenarios, please speak to your volume licensing specialist and they'll be able to go through the full details of this with you. So as we take a look at the different types of remote desktop clients that are out there today, well, it's not just Windows. There's Android, there's iOS, there's Mac. So pretty much, covering most of the bases that are out there. Now, you've got access to the desktop session itself, or alternatively, as I mentioned, to just directly to the application with Remote App. And it's an optimized experience across a variety of different form factors. So it's not just a client with a similar experience that you get on all of the different platforms. It's optimized for the different touch approaches, to the different gestures that the different operating platforms provide. So taking into account things like screen size and resolution, etc. as well. If we take a look at the enhancement of the remote desktop protocol, it's actually improved quite a bit version to version. So if we take a look here, we've got with RDP 7.1 we had enhancements with remote FX, we had USB redirection. RDP 8 started having support for adaptive graphics, better support for low bandwidth, and the progressive remote FX Callisto codec meant that things like streaming video, etc., with H.264 just kept getting better. Then with the RDP 8.1, there was a big focus on being able to go through and leverage low power devices to be able to get that experience in a very, very high performance manner. And as we move across to RDP 10, some of the big enhancements here are around codec enhancement to make sure that the streaming experience for users continues to get better, as well as leveraging support for pen remoting. So even though touch capabilities were introduced with RDP 8, RDP 10 introduced support for pen. So for organizations that were issuing pen-based devices, this was something that they could start leveraging with remote desktop services as well. So if we take a look, what are some of the enhancements we've got? So as I've already alluded to, we've got increased performance in graphics. We've also got enhanced scale. Now, most of the people who are purchasing Windows Server for remote desktop through the OEM channel aren't necessarily interested in massive scale. Normally they're smaller deployments, but you can still benefit from some of these. And the other thing as well is for people who are looking at, well, how do we deploy on-prem? How do we deploy in the cloud? This is also something that Server 2016 Remote Desktop Services takes into consideration. So if we take a look at the graphics virtualization evolution with Hyper-V, which is enabling a lot of these capabilities, what we've got here is once we introduced Remote FX vGPU with Windows Server 2008, this meant that all of the sessions were getting some kind of acceleration from a system that did have that Remote FX general purpose GPU acceleration. Then as we moved into Windows Server 2012, we went from DX9 to DX10 support, as well as having the VM connect with the vGPU and GPU management capabilities. Moving into Server 2012 R2, then we moved up to DX11.1 support, higher video memory, screen resolution jumped up to 2560 by 16, and then as we moved into Windows Server 2016, this is where you can really see some huge improvements. So support for OpenGL 4.4 was added, OpenCL 1.1 support, up to 1 GB of dedicated VRAM for the sessions, up to 4K video resolution support as well, the server virtual machine support, so if you want to run Windows Server VMs for people to access as personal desktops, for example, they can also be accelerated. And along with that, things like improved performance. Now, the other thing you've got here is DDA, so discrete device assignment. And we'll talk about this, but what it means is that we've got the ability to expose the graphics capabilities of the GPU directly to the VM. And what this means here is when we talk about full API support, is that we actually need to go through and install the GPU driver into the VM to actually start leveraging all of these capabilities. So we're basically just passing it through via the PCI Express bus so that we can take full advantage of the performance of that GPU rather than having it available for like generic purposes. It's actually there so that any applications that actually need that acceleration, need the optimized drivers, etc., will be able to leverage that natively. Now, if we take a look at a few more of the capabilities that we've got in here, I won't go through all of these because you can sort of pause this and spend as much time as you like and do some searches on some of the additional information. But things like the application compatibility are really big improvements here. So you can see here that we've got support for DX. When we do direct device assignment, DX12, OpenGL, CUDA, etc. So what we're really trying to do here is comparing RemoteFX virtual GPU versus direct device assignment. So the way to think about this is the RemoteFX vGPU is something that's being exposed to from a general purpose perspective to the to the virtual machine. So the virtual machine itself doesn't actually need to have the drivers installed for that. It's just something that will benefit from the processing power of a GPU. Whereas, as I mentioned with direct device assignment, we're actually assigning the GPU into the GPU or even potentially multiple GPUs into a virtual machine. Now, if we take a look here at some of the other options that it talks about, depending on what kind of frame rates, etc., you need 30 frames per second versus up to 60 frames per second. The GPU driver in the guest, as I mentioned, it's a generic Microsoft one with RemoteFX, but when you're using direct device assignment, that's where you can see that NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel GPUs are all supported there. Now, the guest OS support, you'll see here that once we start talking about direct device assignment, the operating systems that are supported is actually a smaller list because specific functionality needs to be built into those in order for that to be provided. So let's go through now and start talking about a few more of these things, but important things to note here is you'll see here when it talks about the GPU hardware is that we're not talking about consumer grade GPUs. Generally we need to use enterprise or workstation class GPUs and the appropriate drivers that are supplied for those. So for the codec enhancements, which I've referenced without really talking about just yet, we've got the high quality 444 mode using H.264 AVC. We've got the 420 hardware decoders. Now these are enabled by default for vGPU scenarios. We've got enhancements to the Windows 10 remote desktop client, as well as those enhancements being rolled into the remote desktop clients that are available out there on different platforms. For organizations that are looking at larger degrees of scale, we've also got things like the ability to start really scaling up so that when we do have a scenario where we've got lots of users logging in at the same time, so in this case they're talking about 10,000 plus concurrent connection requests, it means that we can go through and actually scale quite easily. So leveraging higher performance on-prem SQL databases, or if we've got the bandwidth, even supporting the Azure SQL database service as well. So if you really want to talk about scaling on demand as needed, that's what that SQL database in Azure can handle for you. When it comes to building out your infrastructure for VDI scenarios, one of the recommendations that Microsoft does make here is to investigate storage spaces replica to see is this something that's actually going to be able to allow you to start replicating the storage. Do you want to use storage spaces direct? So you can actually start doing hyperconverged deployments. Now again, this is something that we have covered in more detail in previous recordings, but what we're doing with storage spaces direct in a hyperconverged environment is saying that we want the storage server to also be the Hyper-V server. So the things that you really need to take into account in those scenarios is that there's a lot of processing power required for both of those to really make sure that you've got great performance. So if someone's talking about like a server with a couple of cores and maybe multi-threaded, probably not going to be a great server for that. Whereas if someone's talking about lots of cores, lots of memory, it's probably going to do a much better job. Now, some of the other improvements that we'll talk about. So support for Generation 2 virtual machines is now supported. So even though Hyper-V has had support for Gen 2 VM since Server 2012 R2, some of these enhanced remote desktop services capabilities weren't available. Now the end user experience changes, we've spoken about some of these, but things like the pen remoting support, improvements in the client desktop, as well as Zoom functionality. Now we've also got personal session desktops running on top of Windows Server as opposed to Windows desktop clients if you choose to deploy it that way. And also now for those of you who have used Windows multi-point services in the past, that it's now available as a role inside of Windows Server rather than as a standard product. Now just quite quickly, we'll cover off the licensing requirements here for remote desktop services. So remember that with the remote desktop services, you need to start off with either the user CAL or the device CAL, and then you also need to add the RDS CAL. So important to note that you can buy your user CALs and device CALs through OEM or through FPP or other channels, but with the RDS CAL, it's not actually available through the OEM channel, but you can buy it through, again, FPP or through other channels. Now, when we take a look at VDI deployment scenarios, if we take a look in here in terms of the virtualization host server, as we go from 2016 down, you'll see that we've got support in 2016 and 2012 R2 for the same operating system, so Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, and Windows 10. When we go down to Windows Server 2012, from a VDI scenario perspective, it doesn't have support for Windows 10 there, but really now we're talking about something that's 2 versions old there with Windows Server, so not really too much of an issue. If we take a look at how the GPU acceleration with Hyper-V works here, with a comparison of Gen 1 VMs versus Gen 2 VMs versus working with discrete device assignment with Gen 2 VMs, the big differences that you'll note here is that as we go through, it's not that one is universally better than the others. You'll see that there are different options available on the different client platforms. So it's really worth taking a look at this to say, well, what's the best experience we're going to get, and then choosing the appropriate way of deploying that. So in some cases it might be remote FX, in other cases it might be using discrete device assignment, but it's also going to be very, very application workload specific. Now let's just quickly talk about multi-point server. So it's a solution that allows multiple users to connect into one computer. And when we're connecting into one computer, where this is different to remote desktop services in general is that we can go through and connect from a variety of different device types, so even like more extensive than what we get with remote desktop services. So we've got scenarios where you can connect directly into video ports on the computer, connecting in additional mice and keyboards and having those associated with those different display ports, for example. You've got multifunction USB hubs, as well as things that have USB over Ethernet type devices, as well as treating it more like remote desktop services and connecting over the local area network. So this just gives you a number of different ways to connect in. So in environments where hardware costs might be a big factor, and people just want to sort of get the most out of the hardware they've got before they're looking at refresh cycles, etc., multi-point services might be a way of you sort of extending the life of some of those solutions for a longer time period. Now we'll move into the second last section, which is deploying Office on remote desktop services. So first up, which Office SKUs can you deploy? So the important thing here is that it's been quite a while now since where for quite a while you did actually need a volume license version of Office to deploy on remote desktop services. But the other option that you've got now is you can actually deploy it via Office 365 Pro Plus. So one of the things that is important here is that Office 365 Pro Plus, when it originally shipped, it didn't have support for remote desktop services. You did actually need to have a base volume license just to do the installation, and then you could leverage the Office 365 Pro Plus license on top of that. So as we start taking a look, the changes that they've made is that now that it's got support for shared computer activation. So this means that we can support things like virtual desktops and applications, shared physical computers, and also it's important to note that it doesn't count against the 5 computers that your Office 365 Pro Plus installation does count against. Now in order to deploy this, you've got 2 different deployment tools depending on whether you're deploying an Office 2013 based version of Office or a 2016 based version of Office. So you just deploy the or install the appropriate ODT. Now from an Office 365 Pro Plus perspective, it was July 2014, so it's basically been over 2.5 years now since Office has actually had native support for being deployed onto remote desktop services. So it's important to note when we do talk about Office 365 Pro Plus that we are specifically talking about Office 365 Pro Plus as a standalone option or as the version of Office that's included with the E3 or the E5 plans from Microsoft. Where some people do get caught out with this is if they have, they might have Office 365 Business Premium licenses, and they try to, and they're sort of trying to figure out how they get that installed on remote desktop services. But that version that's included doesn't include the remote desktop services capabilities. So you'll see here that it's based on Office 365 Business, and it doesn't support shared computer activation. So important to note if you are new to the Office 365 world and you are thinking about remote desktop services, you really should be looking at things like the Office 365 E3 plans, which will include that capability. Now for the user experience, first of all, Office 365 Pro Plus is installed, but it isn't activated yet. And when the first user logs in, Office temporarily activates. And then when Office 2 logs in, Office user 2 logs in, Office temporarily activates. And everything's good there. And then if user number 3 logs in who's not an Office 365 user, Office isn't going to activate for that user. So that's where that user is going to run into issues there. So the way that we can go through and configure this is we change the default configuration XML file that ships with the Office deployment tool, and we go through, and what we need to add in there is the property name equals shared computing license value equals 1 option. Now the ODT itself includes a lot more information on that, so I won't spend a lot of time here. This is just more of a pointer to tell you where to go to get that information. Now when you take a look at what's involved in additional steps for enabling the shared computer activation on an existing desktop, so where Office is already deployed, you can either apply the configuration XML file, so if you've worked with ODT, you're probably already familiar with how to do that, or alternatively you can just go through and modify the registry key. So let's just talk about some of the things you need to think about when you are deploying Office in VDI and remote desktop type environments. So with with Outlook specifically, you need to think about the OST file. So with some of the older versions of Office, it didn't do a great job with Outlook. Search might work, but it might be slow. The results may not show exactly what you want there. But sometimes when people did try to enable the local cache, they didn't necessarily have the appropriate hardware to actually scale out with that. But what's been changed with Outlook 2016 is that in cached mode, it's got a new service for the search experience, where it will go through and basically it searches against the local cache, and in some scenarios it can still fall back to using the local search indexer, but in most cases the searches are going to use that new service search feature. So if you take a quick look at the recommendation here, the recommendation for pooled VDI and RDSH deployments is to use it in cache mode with network connectivity to allow that service search to work. So that way we can really start leveraging the capabilities where they're best going to be delivered. With OneDrive for Business, the important thing here is that it's not supported for multi-user environments, so instead users will need to connect into the web interface. And with Skype for Business, it's not supported in RDSH deployments, but it is supported in VDI environments. So take a look at the different documentation that I've got referenced here just to see how that might impact some of the scenarios that you're thinking about. So let's move on to the final section now, which is resources. So really we've got one big event which is coming up this month in February. So depending on when you actually get to watch this, this may have already happened, but if it hasn't happened and you are going to be at Ignite, please come along. There'll be several of us from the OEM team there. So there'll be Thomas working in the device area, and I'll be working in the readiness and the hands-on labs area, as well as popping down to the device section. So make sure you swing by and say hello. And then for those of you who are thinking about doing some Windows 10 certifications, contact me on the email address I've got on the next slide, because we've actually got some exam vouchers and practice exams available for free for people who meet certain qualifications. But effectively, it's for people who may have got old certs that they need to update, people who are sort of close to getting the certifications but haven't quite gotten there. And if you want more details, we'll be posting about this on a number of different sites over the coming weeks. But for now, once you see this, if you haven't seen anything already, please use the email address that I'll bring up on screen now. So for the resources, don't forget that for more technical focused content, you can take a look at the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site where, I try to get at least 1 or 2 posts up per week. The pre-sales information for OEM server products is oemserverau@microsoft.com. So if you are also interested in those Windows 10 exam options that I mentioned, please contact me on that and just put Windows 10 readiness in there and I'll know what that deals with. Now also, don't forget we've got the revamped Microsoft Smart HQ site at www.microsoftsmarthq.com.au, and this is where you can get access to a lot of sales, marketing, and technical information around Windows Desktop, Windows on the server, Office, as well as Windows 10 devices. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining today, and don't forget, contact us via one of the means we've got on that previous page if you do need more information on any of the things that we've covered. And hopefully we get to see you at some of the events in the future. So thank you very much for joining.